Jesus and his disciples have been traveling all over the land, preaching the good news. Whereas his ministry had started out so full of promise and hope, with so many people coming to know and understand God differently, things were changing. The dominant forces of the status quo, and most notably, certain hardline elements within the Jewish leadership, are increasingly taking a firm stand against Jesus, and they are looking to disrupt his ministry in any way they can. It is not that Jesus is universally despised by the Jewish leadership. Many are intrigued by his ministry and the things he is saying. I have the feeling that if they could follow Jesus without any of their friends or associates knowing, they would jump in, maybe with both feet. But that's an obstacle for them, and for many people even today. They aren't willing to embrace change if it requires losing too many friends or their place in society. Many of the Jewish leaders, however, are not open to any of the changes Jesus represents. In fact, they are afraid of the changes, and this fear breeds hate, two powerful motivators. They really bring out the enthusiasm and verve on the part of those who oppose him. They want to kill Jesus. More than that, they feel completely justified in doing so. Jesus corrupts their faith by challenging the law of Moses and their scriptures, and because of this, he challenges their societal power. In their minds, however, it is just about the faith corrupting issues. That's what concerns them most. The center of this resistance is in Judea, from where Jesus had only recently and barely escaped with his life, narrowly avoiding the stoning party that they threw for him. It's hard to throw a good stoning party when the guest of honor manages to sneak out. With all the heat focused on Jesus, he and the disciples are laying low, drinking watery coffee in the alley behind the library as the disciples fight over the sports section. The place is mostly deserted when a tall, heavily cloaked man with an unusual gait rounds the corner toward them. Peter looks over at Jesus with apprehension in his eyes, but Jesus seems relaxed as he studies the stranger. He notices something familiar about the man and tells the others that it's okay. They let him pass, and he approaches Jesus. The man's face is partially covered. He bends down like he is going to whisper in Jesus' ear, only to blurt out hoarsely and loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Lord, the one you love is sick." It is then that Jesus puts together that the man is Mary and Martha's short personal assistant, wearing ill-fitting stilts beneath his cloak to disguise himself. Without even the slightest goodbye, their assistant turns and limps away. A moment passes. "The one you love is sick," repeats James as he looks at Jesus. "Trust me, Lord, I am fine. I don't know what he's talking about." "That's because he was not talking about you," replied Peter. "But I too am fine, Lord." Without even the slightest roll of his eyes, Jesus says, "It is Lazarus who is sick." "Who is Lazarus?" asked Peter. "Mary and Martha's brother." Peter and James look at each other and then ask in surprised unison, "They have a brother?" You see, prior to that point in the book of John, which was the last of the Gospels to be written, nobody in the Bible seems to have known that Mary and Martha had a brother, which was especially surprising given that Jesus and the gang visited Mary and Martha's home back in the 10th chapter of Luke. That was when Martha invited Jesus to their home, but Mary kind of stole the show by listening attentively to Jesus while Martha busied herself with housewarming preparations. When Martha complained to Jesus about Mary's loaferism, Jesus sided with Mary, saying that being present with the Lord in that moment was more important than busy preparations. "Yes, they have a brother," Jesus replied. "And he's the one you love?" asked an incredulous James. Peter moved on in the conversation. "He must be quite sick for them to send word. Will he die, Lord?" "This sickness will not end in death," Jesus replies. "It is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Peter and James aren't sure what he meant by this, but they are used to not understanding much of what Jesus says. It is as if they are always about 3 blocks behind in any conversation with Jesus. With this urgent new information from the assistant, Jesus immediately leans forward and pours himself another cup of coffee out of his thermos. Then, without a moment to lose, he and the others set out, somewhat inexplicably, to do absolutely nothing. This is A-OK with the disciples, because the last thing they want to do is return to Mary and Martha's Bethany village in Judea, where some of Jesus' biggest fans last held his stoning party. After a couple days, however, Jesus finally stands up out of the blue and tells them that it is time to go back to Judea. Why would we go back there? Asked the disciples, wanting no part of Judea right then. Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Jesus asks. Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by the world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. The expressions on James and John's faces betray the fact that they have no clue what Jesus is talking about. Seeing their expression, Jesus tells them that Lazarus has fallen asleep, so he needs to go and wake him up. Of course, we all know that Lazarus already died, but the disciples took Jesus literally and wonder why he wants to risk everything in Judea just to wake Lazarus up from a nap. None of this is making sense to them. Sidebar, whenever I hear the part of Jesus saying that Lazarus is sleeping to the disciples, it reminds me of a dad telling their 3-year-old child that their favorite guppy, laying motionless on its side at the bottom of the fish tank, is simply asleep, while a mom rushes out to the pet store to buy a replacement. At any rate, Jesus is not oblivious to their confusion, so he finally spells it out clearly. Lazarus is gone, deceased, kaput, dead as a doornail. But for some reason, Jesus is oddly glad about it and tells them it is this way so the disciples might have more belief. While Thomas may be counted among those not yet sold on everything Jesus has to say, he nonetheless is comically gung-ho when he offers that they all go and die with Jesus. So they finally set out for Judea. By the time they arrive, old Lazarus has already been buried in a tomb for 4 days, and Mary and Martha are in mourning. Many Jews had come to offer consolation. Maybe it was for this reason that dutiful Martha, hearing that Jesus was coming, went out to meet him before they arrived, to prevent another attempt on Jesus' life, while Mary ran interference at home. That doesn't stop Martha from dishing it out to Jesus when she sees him. Lord, had you been here, my brother would still be alive, laying the blame squarely on Jesus' feet. But she desperately wants to have faith that something can be done, and she says to him that God will give Jesus anything for which he asks, hoping that maybe there is something that can still be done. Jesus reassures her that her brother will rise again, but Martha is not satisfied. Yes, I know he will rise again at the end of time, according to Jewish belief, but clearly that isn't enough for her. Jesus replies, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Martha never answers this question directly, because answering that anyone who believes in Jesus will never die seems a bit crazy. After all, Lazarus, her brother, is dead, and he has been dead and buried for 4 days at that point. Instead, Martha says, Yes, Lord, you are the Messiah, which is not the same thing. She knows this, and so does Jesus. Jesus then asks to see Mary, so Martha returns to fetch her sister. While Martha is the one that always seems to hold it together, Mary's passion is never far from the surface. Though Martha pulled her aside to privately tell her that Jesus asked for her, the way she bolted out of the door immediately raised curiosity among the Jews in mourning with her, who assumed that she was going to mourn at the tomb of Lazarus. They set out to follow her. It seems that no matter what, Jesus always ends up drawing the attention of the authorities. Moving on the down low just isn't in the cards for him. When Mary gets to where Jesus is, she completely loses it, crumpling into a weeping ball at Jesus' feet. Then, like her sister, Mary lets Jesus have it. Lord, If you had been here, my brother would not have died." Her tears are infectious. The Jews that accompany her start weeping right along with her, and soon enough, Jesus joins in. He isn't even sure why, since he knows he's going to raise Lazarus. That was his plan all along. But that is part of what he loves so much about Mary. She is so fully in this moment, every moment, that she can turn nearly anyone with a heart into a sympathetic crier. Some of the Jews watching this unfold are taken by Jesus' love of Lazarus, swept up into that moment with them. Others, however, doubt his sincerity, wondering through shadowed murmurs how hard it would have been to keep Lazarus from dying if he was able to cure the blind man, which he did in chapter 9. Jesus asks to be taken to the tomb, and when they arrive, it has a stone sealing it closed. He asks that the stone be removed. Martha was aghast, because the decomposing body had been fermenting in the tomb for 4 days. According to the King James Version, the ever practical Martha told Jesus, "Lord, by this time he stinketh." Jesus responds, "Didn't I tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" He's calling Martha out on her disbelief. Martha is practical. She needs to see it to believe it. Mary, by contrast, somehow has the ability to live into her belief. After they remove the stone, Jesus calls out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" Nothing happens at first. Then they hear a groan. It sounds like somebody bumped their head inside the tomb, followed by a slow, "Ow!" Then, to the shock of most gathered, Lazarus, still wrapped and bound in his bandages, shuffles slowly out of the tomb. "Little help?" he asked in a hoarse voice. After all, he had been dead for 4 days and surely needed a drink of water. "I can't see a thing," he says. "Take the grave clothes off him and let him go," Jesus tells the others, "and get the man a drink of water." While most gathered were flabbergasted by the greatest miracle anyone had ever witnessed, for the Jewish leadership, it only convinced them that Jesus had to be killed for the good of everyone. Jesus' greatest miracle, raising a man who had been dead for 4 days, a period of time so long that nobody could deny it, not even his critics. Because, as it was said earlier, they wouldn't believe even if a man was raised from the dead. It is interesting, isn't it, that this, the greatest of his miracles, a miracle performed in front of so many people, wasn't even mentioned in any of the other Gospels, all of which were written prior to John. It wasn't mentioned in any of Paul's writings, which preceded the Gospels. While getting my MBA, I took a class on advertising taught by the man who created the Got Milk ad campaign in the 80s. He talked about how great ads must have one underlying insight to which people can relate. It doesn't have to be super profound, but it has to be relatable to the intended audience. In the case of the Got Milk campaign, this simple insight is that milk goes really well with some things like cookies. And it is true, at least for me. As much as I love cookies, brownies, and cake, it just isn't the same without milk. Ads that don't have this insight are ineffective, he taught. I find these key insights in many gospel stories. These insights are the part on which everything seems to hinge. At first, they may seem like minor, irrelevant bits, like they could have been left out and it wouldn't have mattered until you really dig in. With the wedding at Cana, it was the stone jars of purification. Why did the authors insert that? Why did that matter? Jesus can turn water into wine. Why did they have to mention that those jars were the jars used in the Jewish rites of purification? After thinking about it for a while, I noticed that these jars were the key to unlocking the meaning of the whole story. The law alone can't transform lives. Only God's light found in Jesus can do that. That is the point. Turning water into wine was secondary. In this story, A key insight is the 12 hours of daylight statement about needing light in the dark. It is a confusing statement and feels like it is kind of a square peg in a round hole at that point in the story, but I believe the story hinges upon it. It is easy to avoid those statements in stories because they often seem slightly out of place, and it may be confusing to understand. It is just easier to gloss over them because we don't want to think that hard. On the surface, this story is about raising Lazarus from the dead, this great miracle. But what if it really isn't about that? It is the last miracle in the book of John prior to the trial and crucifixion, and the parallels foretelling Jesus' death and resurrection seem hard to miss. Their Lord and Savior will be dead, killed, and for them, those who trusted in Jesus, and therefore who trusted in God, it will seem as though God himself is dead. Jesus' followers will be afraid and in hiding. Everything they knew or thought they knew has collapsed. Where was God when Jesus was accused? Where was God when he was arrested? Where was God when Jesus was strung up? Where was God when Jesus breathed his last breath? Everyone assumed that God would, at some point, intervene. Surely he would intervene. God, if only you had been there, Jesus would still be alive. Have you ever thought those same thoughts? Maybe just a little? But he wasn't there. He was gone. They had nothing but their fears. They were surrounded by darkness. This is a familiar feeling to many people right now. This feeling of being surrounded by darkness. We feel the walls closing in, with people, including citizens, getting detained, some executed in the streets, with protesters being beaten and followed, with reporters being locked up, with so many rights we took for granted now being threatened. So Jesus tells his disciples, "It is time to go to Judea. It is time to walk where there is darkness, because the light matters not when it is light out, when things are going good. Light matters when it is dark, when fear abounds and people cannot find their way. That is when and where the light is needed." So they venture into the darkness, carrying God's light in their hearts. In spite of being surrounded by darkness, they carry with them love and hope and faith and healing. They don't match the darkness with darkness, but vanish the darkness with light. They fearlessly walk into the jaws of death, because that is where the light is needed. And when we do this, that is when God shows up. Jesus is the resurrection and the life, and his life is about transformation and the expansion of life, moving beyond the limitations that we perceive, even the boundaries of death. This new life, this new way of being, of a life centered on love, cannot be contained once opened. But we have a hard time getting there. We have a hard time experiencing the rebirth. We have a hard time being born again, finding our reason for change. In so many ways, it takes sickness to get us there. It takes the bottom falling out of our lives for us to realize that the same old won't change us. We need to be broken and chewed up. Our plans have to come crashing down around us. And in the process, it seems like God is nowhere to be found. We are left to suffer. Our prayers are unanswered. Nothing seems to work. God's help is nowhere to be found. Nobody is getting it, not even the disciples. The reality in this story is that for all his ministry up to this point, Jesus is surrounded on all sides by doubt. Sure, there is resistance from many of the Jewish authorities, who outright reject his teachings as blasphemous, but there's resistance even from those who are his followers. Within this story, Jesus is lamenting the disbelief of his own disciples, hoping that the resurrection of Lazarus will finally bring them around to faith, believing in the transformation that Jesus and his teachings represent. Then, out of that pain and suffering, the resurrection happens. In this story, it is Lazarus. I find it interesting that in Hebrew, the name Lazarus means God's help. In the darkest of times, it seems like God's help, the one that Jesus loved, has gone dark, nowhere to be found, that God is dead. And in the days leading up to Jesus' death, that is exactly the way it'll seem to the disciples. God is dead. He's gone, kaput, nowhere to be found. So we have faith. We go back into the darkness, carrying the light of love with us. We have to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, fearing no evil, for God is with us. The love that is in Jesus is in us. So we muster the courage to go back, and that is when we have faith. That is when we have hope. That is when we take action and we carry the light of God's love into the darkness. Because by doing so, God's help rises again through our hands and through our feet. We must remember to live this life through love so that we too may believe again. I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?